Nannie Doss.
Nannie Doss.
The Giggling Nanny.
The Giggling Granny. The story of the Giggling Granny isn't like any run-of-the-mill serial killer story because, while most killers usually kill strangers, she murdered immediate family members. On the one hand, some people chalk up Nannie Doss's murderous streak to a hard upbringing and abusive spouses. But on the other hand, others believe that most of her murders were acts of greed, committed for no apparent reason. Did she have a hard life? Yes. Was that the reason for her murders? Most likely not. Did her victims deserve to die? No. With that being said, let's unravel the life and story of the Giggling Granny to find out for ourselves. Early childhood. Nannie Doss was born on November 4th, 1905, to parents James Hazel and Lou Nay Holder. Nannie was one of 5 children in the Hazel family. She had 1 brother and 3 sisters. At the time of Nannie's birth, her entire family resided in Blue Mountain, a small town between Anniston and Jacksonville in Alabama. From the outside, the Doss family looked like a typical Southern household with a picket fence and a farm. But no one besides the family members knew what transpired on those lands. And while Nannie would go on to later become a murderous romantic, her father set the pace for some of the major onsets of her flawed personality traits. Old James Hazel was as hard and abusive as they come when handling his family. He'd rather his family farm be taken care of than for his children to receive proper education, and he did just that. James would have Nannie and her siblings working on the farm all day as farmhands, keeping them from attending school and causing them to miss out on a proper education. This is what attributed to Nannie's poor academic performance, and the primary reason why the entire family, including their mother, hated James. Unlike her father, Nannie's mother, Lou, was gracious to her children and was probably one of the few good things she had going on in her childhood. Lou had a thing for romance novels and magazines, and with a husband like James, who wouldn't blame her? One of Nannie's hobbies was reading her mother's romance novels and having such a bleak childhood. It was not long before she began dreaming of finding romance in her life too. As she read, Nannie took a shine to the Lonely Hearts column, because despite being in a house full of people, she was quite lonely. This was in part because not only did their father keep them from regularly attending school, he also forbade the girls from wearing any attractive clothes or even makeup well into their teen years. In his twisted way, James believed he was protecting his daughters from molesters, and apparently having them wear rags was the best way to go about it. He also prohibited them from attending any kind of social events. No school dances or birthday parties, meaning that they rarely ever left the farm. Childhood injury. There was no clear-cut incident where something in Nannie's head snapped to make her start her murderous streak, but she attributed it to an injury she sustained when she was little. When she was 7 years old, Nannie's whole family was on their way to visit relatives in southern Alabama, and they were on a train for the commute. En route to their destination, something surprising happened when the train stopped abruptly, and Nannie, who was sitting on her own, hit her head on the metal bar of the seat directly in front of her due to the impact. Allegedly due to the injury, Nannie suffered severe headaches, had blackouts and dizzy spells, and suffered from depression in the years that followed. Nannie would later go on to blame her mental instability and personality disorders on that fateful accident. First marriage and murder. In 1921, Nannie started her job at the Linen Thread Company, a local thread-making factory close to her home in Anniston. It was at this job she met Charles Braggs, a colleague at the factory, and the two reportedly started dating with the approval of Nannie's father. The young couple had only been dating for a few months when her father asked 16-year-old Nannie to marry Braggs, and of course, she obeyed, and the couple was married weeks later. One would expect things to be better now that she was out of her abusive father's house, but the situation only worsened thanks to one person, Nannie's mother-in-law. Bragg's mother proved to be a problem in Nannie's marriage, as she insisted on living with her son even after he was married. He was her only son, and because she was unmarried at the time, Braggs had to accept it. Bragg's mother took up most of his time and attention, even going as far as putting a leash on Nannie's activities. Nannie wasn't allowed to leave the house whenever she wanted, and when her mother came to visit, she wasn't allowed to spend the night. Between 1923 and 1927, the couple had 4 daughters, and within that time, her mother-in-law's temperament only seemed to worsen. Nannie, who only drank and smoked casually, was now heavily addicted. Her marriage to Braggs had turned sour as both partners now suspected the other of infidelity, which was accurate on both counts. Braggs regularly disappeared for days at a time. And this was when Nannie's murderous streak began. In 1927, 2 of Nannie's daughters mysteriously died after having a breakfast that their mother had prepared for them. An investigation into the incident revealed that both girls had died as a result of food poisoning, which was weird because Nannie had reportedly shared the same breakfast with them, but surprisingly, nothing happened to her. How the police didn't find this fact strange is beyond weird. Soon after the incident, Braggs fled the house with their eldest daughter, Melvina, leaving behind their newborn, Florin, after his mother warned him not to eat anything his wife cooked because she suspected her of poisoning the children. Braggs made the right move by fleeing and earned the title of being the only husband not killed by Nannie. Braggs returned with Melvina in the summer of 1928 with a new girlfriend and a new child. The couple got divorced immediately after his return, and Nannie moved back in with her parents, taking a job at a cotton mill to provide for herself and her daughters. Second marriage and more murders. Nannie met her next husband, Franklin Harrelson, through a Lonely Hearts column in the newspaper, and they exchanged letters of poetry and steamy photographs. They got married that same year, but things soon took a turn for the worse as Harrelson's violent temper and alcoholism began to taint their marriage. But despite his obvious character flaws, the marriage stood firm and lasted for 16 years, and in this time, Nannie's daughter Melvina got married. Melvina had her first son in 1943 and a daughter 2 years later, but while she was still at the hospital, exhausted from the rigors of delivery, Melvina thought she saw something impossible. She saw her mother, Nannie, kill her day-old daughter by sticking a hairpin in her skull. Melvina woke to the news of her infant daughter's death, and upon telling her husband and sister what she saw, they also corroborated that they saw a hairpin with Nannie shortly after she told them the baby had died. The tragic incident caused Melvina and her husband to drift apart till they eventually separated. Meanwhile, dear old Nannie took out a $500 life insurance on Melvina's 2-year-old son, Robert. On one fateful day in July of 1945, Melvina had a rather nasty argument with her mother about the man she was currently dating, which Nannie didn't approve of. The argument got so heated, Melvina stormed off to stay with her father for a while, leaving little Robert in her mother's care. On July 7th, Robert allegedly died of asphyxiation while alone with Nannie, and a couple of months later, she cashed in on Robert's life insurance. Unfortunately for her family, Nannie's grandson wasn't the only murder the deranged woman would commit that year. In fact, her husband was next on the list. With the end of World War II, there were heavy celebrations, so much so that Nannie's husband, a chronic alcoholic, drank way too much and, upon getting home intoxicated, raped Nannie. Instead of filing for a divorce or 10 other things she could have done, Nannie instead put rat poison in his whiskey the very next day, and Harrelson was dead before the day's end. Third marriage and even more murders. Not one to stay single, Nannie met her third husband, Arlie Lanning, through the Lonely Hearts column of the newspaper again. This time, the couple were married only after knowing each other for 3 days. But apparently, Nannie had a knack for picking the bad apples, as Lanning was also a womanizer and alcoholic like her previous husband. After a few years of turbulent marriage, her husband, who was young and seemingly healthy, died of what was diagnosed as heart failure. After her husband mysteriously died, Nannie hoped she would get the house, but it turned out Lanning willed it to his sister. Never one to let anyone get the better of her, Nannie set the house on fire and got the hefty insurance money, but not before killing Lanning's mother, who had a broken hip and lived with them. With nowhere to live now, Nannie moved in with her sister, Dovey, who was bedridden at the time. Dovey met an untimely death soon after Nannie moved in. Fourth marriage and, well, more murders. Nannie finally decided to leave the Lonely Hearts column of the newspaper, and so she joined a dating service, Diamond Circle Club. This seemed to work out well for her as she met her fourth husband, Richard L. Morton, in 1952, who, unlike her previous husbands, wasn't a raging alcoholic. But although Morton wasn't an alcoholic, he was still a prolific womanizer, and he spent most nights with different women outside his marriage. Only a year into the marriage, Nannie was already plotting how to murder Morton, but not before her mother dropped in unexpectedly. Nannie's mother, Lou, had just lost her husband and thought it would be a good idea to move in with her daughter. But that was a fatal mistake. Only a few days into her visit, Lou experienced severe stomach pains before dying that same day. High on her murderous streak, Nannie killed her husband only 3 days after killing her mother by spiking his coffee with arsenic. Last husband and arrest. Only a few months after the death of her fourth husband, Nannie was already on the prowl for a fifth, and she found him 3 states over in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Samuel Doss happens to be the only husband with no obvious faults, as he wasn't an alcoholic, nor was he abusive or a womanizer. But dear old Nannie still found reasons to want him dead. The only clear indication of why she would have wanted him dead was that he was a minister and didn't allow romance novels or any non-educational shows or books in his house. At this point, it's no news that Nannie loved her some romance novels. So I guess in her mind, he simply had to die. Poor Mr. Doss was hospitalized after eating a prune cake laced with arsenic, but he shockingly survived the ordeal, and the doctors diagnosed him with severe digestive tract infection. After he was discharged, Nannie didn't waste any time finishing the job by poisoning his coffee with arsenic again. This time, she managed to kill him the very day as soon as he came home from the hospital. As per her usual MO, Nannie had taken out 2 life insurance policies on Doss, but her greed got the best of her. Doss's doctor found his sudden death strange and highly unlikely and ordered an autopsy be carried out. The autopsy revealed heavy amounts of arsenic in his system, which confirmed the good doctor's suspicion, and Nannie was immediately arrested. Trial and prison sentence. During interrogations, Nannie refused to confess, not until she was told she could have her romance novels in jail. She confessed to killing her grandson, Robert, her second husband, Harrelson, her third husband, Lanning, his mother, her sister, Dovey, her mother, Lou, her fourth husband, Morton, and her last husband, Samuel. She earned the nickname Giggling Granny because she was constantly giggling and smiling while admitting or discussing her crimes. Because of her gender, Nannie escaped the death sentence. But after pleading guilty on the 17th of May 1955, she instead got a life sentence with no hope of parole. She often joked and smiled during interviews with reporters when discussing her murders, keeping a sheepish deposition, even in prison. She told reporters that she had requested to work in the prison kitchens, but was never allowed to work anywhere else except laundry. I wonder why. Eventual death. Nannie died on the 2nd of June in 1965 after suffering from chronic leukemia in the hospital ward of Oklahoma State Penitentiary. She was buried at Oak Hill Memorial Park in McAlester, Oklahoma, with no family claiming her body or even showing up to her funeral.